Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he just chuckled inside and said nothing whatever about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, just crept along, very carefully and quietly." "Well, it is the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and not been spotted," said Balin, "and I take my hood off to you." Which he did. "Balin, at your service," said he. "Your servant, Mr. Baggins," said Bilbo. Then they wanted to know all about his adventures after they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything except about the finding of the ring. Not just now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition and shuddered most appreciatively at his description of Gollum. And then I couldn't think of any other question with him sitting beside me, ended Bilbo. So I said, "What's in my pocket?" And he couldn't guess in 3 goes. So I said, "What about your promise? Show me the way out." But he came at me to kill me, and I ran and fell over, and he missed me in the dark. Then I followed him because I heard him talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, so he was making for it. And then he sat down in the entrance, and I could not get by. So I jumped over him and escaped and ran down to the gate. "What about the guards?" they asked. "Weren't there any?" "Oh, yes, lots of them, but I dodged them. I got stuck in the door, which was only open a crack, and I lost lots of buttons," he said, sadly looking at his torn clothes. "But I squeezed through all right, and here I am." The dwarves looked at him with quite a new respect when he talked about dodging guards, jumping over Gollum, and squeezing through, as if it was not very difficult or very alarming. "What did I tell you?" said Gandalf, laughing. "Mr. Baggins has more about him than you guess." He gave Bilbo a queer look from under his bushy eyebrows as he said this, and the hobbit wondered if he guessed at the part of his tale that he had left out. Then he had questions of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all by now to the dwarves, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again and where they had all got to now. The wizard, to tell the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once, so now he told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins in that part of the mountains. But their main gate used to come out on a different pass, one more easy to travel by, so that they often caught people benighted near their gates. Evidently, people had given up going that way, and the goblins must have opened up their new entrance at the top of the pass the dwarves had taken quite recently, because it had been found quite safe up to now. "I must see if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again," said Gandalf, "or soon there will be no getting over the mountains at all." As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. In the flash which killed the goblins that were grabbing him, he had nipped inside the crack just as it snapped to. He followed after the drivers and prisoners right to the edge of the Great Hall, and there he sat down and worked up the best magic he could in the shadows. "A very ticklish business it was," he said. "Touch and go." But of course Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments with fire and lights. Even the Hobbit had never forgotten the magic fireworks at Old Took's Midsummer Eve parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew all about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate where Bilbo lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with this part of the mountains, but it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them in the right direction. "They made that gate ages ago," he said, "partly for a way of escape if they needed one, partly as a way out into the lands beyond, where they still come in the dark and do great damage. They guard it always, and no one has ever managed to block it up. They will guard it doubly after this," he laughed. All the others laughed too. After all, they had lost a good deal, but they had killed the great goblin and a great many others besides, and they had all escaped, so they might be said to have had the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses. "We must be getting on at once. Now we are a little rested," he said. "They will be out after us in hundreds when night comes on. And already shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we have passed. We must be miles on before dusk. There will be a bit of a moon if it keeps fine, and that is lucky. Not that they mind the moon much, but it will give us a little light to steer by." "Oh yes," he said, in answer to more questions from the Hobbit. "You lose track of time inside goblin tunnels. Today's Thursday, and it was Monday night or Tuesday morning that we were captured. We have gone miles and miles and come right down through the heart of the mountains and are now on the other side, quite a shortcut. But we are not at the point to which our pass would have brought us. We are too far to the north and have some awkward country ahead. And we are still pretty high up. Let's get on." "I am so dreadfully hungry," groaned Bilbo, who was suddenly aware that he had not had a meal since the night before last. Just think of that for a hobbit. His stomach felt all empty and loose, and his legs all wobbly, now that the excitement was over. "Can't help it," said Gandalf, "unless you like to go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your pony back and your luggage." "No, thank you," said Bilbo. "Very well, then. We must just tighten our belts and trudge on, or we shall be made into supper, and that will be much worse than having none ourselves." As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat, but the blackberries were still only in flower, and of course there were no nuts, not even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a bit of sorrel, and he drank from a small mountain stream that crossed the path, and he ate 3 wild strawberries that he found on its bank, but it was not much good. They still went on and on. The rough path disappeared. The bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, the thyme and the sage, and the marjoram and the yellow rock roses all vanished, and they found themselves at the top of a wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remains of a landslide. When they began to go down this, rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. Soon, larger bits of split stone went clattering down and started other pieces below them slithering and rolling. Then lumps of rock were disturbed and bounded off, crashing down with a dust and a noise. Before long, the whole slope above them and below them seemed on the move, and they were sliding away, huddled all together in a fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, cracking slabs and stones. It was the trees at the bottom that saved them. They slid into the edge of a climbing wood of pines that here stood right up the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forests of the valley below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swung themselves into lower branches. Some, like the little hobbit, got behind a tree to shelter from the onslaught of the rocks. Soon the danger was over, the slide had stopped, and the last faint crashes could be heard as the largest of the disturbed stones went bounding and spinning among the bracken and the pine roots far below. "Well, that has got us on a bit," said Gandalf. "And even goblins tracking us will have a job to come down here quietly." "I dare say," grumbled Bombur, "but they won't find it difficult to send stones bouncing down on our heads." The dwarves and Bilbo were feeling far from happy and were rubbing their bruised and damaged legs and feet. "Nonsense! We're going to turn aside here, out of the path of the slide. We must be quick. Look at the light." The sun had long gone behind the mountains. Already the shadows were deepening about them, though far away through the trees and over the black tops of those growing lower down, they could still see the evening lights on the plains beyond. They limped along now as fast as they were able, down the gentle slopes of a pine forest in a slanting path leading steadily southwards. At times they were pushing through a sea of bracken with tall fronds rising right above the hobbit's head. At times they were marching along quiet as quiet over a floor of pine needles, and all the while the forest gloom got heavier and the forest silence deeper. There was no wind that evening to bring even a sea sighing into the branches of the trees. "Must we go any further?" asked Bilbo when it was so dark he could only just see Thorin's beard wagging beside him, and so quiet that he could hear the dwarves breathing like a loud noise. "My toes are all bruised and bent, and my legs ache, and my stomach is wagging like an empty sack." "A bit further," said Gandalf. After what seemed ages further, they came suddenly to an opening where no trees grew. The moon was up and was shining into the clearing. Somehow it struck all of them as not at all a nice place, although there was nothing wrong to see. All of a sudden, they heard a howl, away downhill, a long, shuddering howl. It was answered by another, away to the right and a good deal nearer to them, then by another not far away to the left. It was wolves howling at the moon, wolves gathering together. There were no wolves living near Mr. Baggins's hole at home, but he knew that noise. He had had it described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins on the Took side, who had been a great traveller, used to imitate it to frighten him. To hear it out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much use against wolves, especially against the evil packs that lived under the shadow of the goblin-infested mountains over the edge of the wild on the borders of the unknown. Wolves of that sort smell keener than goblins and do not need to see you to catch you. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" he cried. "Escaping goblins to be caught by wolves," he said. And it became a proverb, though we now say, out of the frying pan into the fire in the same sort of uncomfortable situations. "Up the trees! Quick!" cried Gandalf, and they ran to the trees at the edge of the glade, hunting for those that had branches fairly low or were slender enough to swarm up. They found them as quick as ever they could, you can guess, and up they went as high as ever they could trust the branches. You would have laughed from a safe distance if you had seen the dwarves sitting up in the trees with their beards dangling down like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing at being boys. Philly and Killy were at the top of a tall larch like an enormous Christmas tree. Dorry, Norry, Orry, Owen and Glowin were more comfortable in a huge pine with regular branches sticking out at intervals like the spokes of a wheel. Biffer, Boffer, Bomber and Thorin were in another. Dwalin and Balin had swarmed up a tall, slender fir with few branches and were trying to find a place to sit in the greenery of the topmost boughs. Gandalf, who was a good deal taller than the others, had found a tree into which they could not climb, a large pine standing at the very edge of the glade. He was quite hidden in its boughs, but you could see his eyes gleaming in the moon as he peeped out. And Bilbo? He could not get into any tree and was scuttling about from trunk to trunk, like a rabbit that has lost its hole and has a dog after it. "You've left the burglar behind again," said Norry to Dorry, looking down. "I can't always be carrying burglars on my back," said Dorry, "down tunnels and up trees. What do you think I am, a porter?" "He'll be eaten if we don't do something," said Thorin, for there were howls all around them now, getting nearer and nearer. "Dorry!" he called, for Dorry was lowest down in the easiest tree. "Be quick and give Mr. Baggins a hand up." Dorry was really a decent fellow in spite of his grumbling. Poor Bilbo could not reach his hand even when he climbed down to the bottom branch and hung his arm down as far as ever he could. So Dorry actually climbed out of the tree and let Bilbo scramble up and stand on his back. Just at that moment, the wolves trotted, howling, into the clearing. All of a sudden, there were hundreds of eyes looking at them. Still, Dorry did not let Bilbo down. He waited till he had clambered off his shoulders into the branches, then he jumped for the branches himself. Only just in time, a wolf snapped at his cloak as he swung up and nearly got him. In a minute, there was a whole pack of them yelping all round the tree and leaping up at the trunk with eyes blazing and tongues hanging out. But even the wild wargs, for so the evil wolves over the edge of the wild were named, cannot climb trees. For a time, they were safe. Luckily, it was warm and not windy. Trees are not very comfortable to sit in for long at any time, but in the cold and the wind, with wolves all round, below, waiting for you, they can be perfectly miserable places. This glade in the ring of trees was evidently a meeting place of the wolves. More and more kept coming in. They left guards at the foot of the tree in which Dorry and Bilbo were, and then went snuffling about till they had smelt out every tree that had anyone in it. These they guarded too, while all the rest, hundreds and hundreds it seemed, went and sat in a great circle in the glade, and in the middle of the circle was a great grey wolf. He spoke to them in a dreadful language of the wargs. Gandalf understood it. Bilbo did not, but it sounded terrible to him. And as if all their talk was about cruel and wicked things, as it was. Every now and then all the wargs in the circle would answer their grey chief all together, and their dreadful clamour almost made the Hobbit fall out of his pine tree. I will tell you what Gandalf heard, though Bilbo did not understand it. The wargs and the goblins often helped one another in wicked deeds. Goblins do not usually venture very far from their mountains unless they are driven out and are looking for new homes, or are marching to war, which I'm glad to say has not happened for a long while. But in those days, they sometimes used to go on raids, especially to get food or slaves to work for them. Then they often got the wargs to help and shared the plunder with them. Sometimes they rode on wolves like men do on horses. Now, it seemed that a great goblin raid had been planned for that very night. The wargs had come to meet the goblins, and the goblins were late. The reason, no doubt, was the death of the great goblin, and all the excitement caused by the dwarves and Bilbo and the wizard, for whom they were probably still hunting. In spite of the dangers of this far land, bold men had of late been making their way back into it from the south, cutting down trees and building themselves places to live in among the more pleasant woods in the valleys and along the river shores. There were many of them, and they were brave and well armed, and even the wargs dare not attack them if there were many together, or in the bright day. But now they had planned, with the goblins' help, to come by night upon some of the villages nearest the mountains. If their plan had been carried out, there would have been none left there next day. All would have been killed, except the few the goblins kept from the wolves and carried back as prisoners to their caves. This was dreadful talk to listen to, not only because of the brave woodmen and their wives and children, but also because of the danger which now threatened Gandalf and his friends. The wargs were angry and puzzled at finding them here in their very meeting place. They thought they were friends of the woodmen and were come to spy on them, and would take news of their plans down into the valley, and then the goblins and the wolves would have to fight a terrible battle instead of capturing prisoners and devouring people waked suddenly from their sleep. So the wargs had no intention of going away and letting the people up the trees escape, at any rate not until morning. And long before that, they said, goblin soldiers would be coming down from the mountains, and goblins can climb trees or cut them down. Now you can understand why Gandalf, listening to their growling and yelping, began to be dreadfully afraid, wizard though he was, and to feel that they were in a very bad place and had not yet escaped at all. All the same, he was not going to let them have it all their own way, though he could not do very much, stuck up a tall tree with wolves all around on the ground below. He gathered the huge pine cones from the branches of his tree. Then he set one alight with bright blue fire and threw it whizzing down among the circle of wolves. It struck one on the back, and immediately his shaggy coat caught fire, and he was leaping to and fro, yelping horribly. Then another came, and another, one in blue flames, one in red, another in green. They burst on the ground in the middle of the circle and went off in coloured sparks and smoke. A specially large one hit the chief wolf on the nose, and he leapt in the air 10 feet, and then rushed round and round the circle, biting and snapping even at the other wolves in his anger and fright. The dwarves and Bilbo shouted and cheered. The rage of the wolves was terrible to see, and the commotion they made filled all the forest. Wolves are afraid of fire at all times, but this was a most horrible and uncanny fire. If a spark got in their coats, it stuck and burnt into them, and unless they rolled over quick, they were soon all in flames. Very soon, all about the glade, wolves were rolling over and over to put out the sparks on their backs, while those that were burning were running about, howling and setting others alight, till their own friends chased them away and they fled off down the slopes, crying and yammering and looking for water. "What is all this uproar in the forest tonight?" said the Lord of the Eagles. He was sitting black in the moonlight on the top of a lonely pinnacle of rock at the eastern edge of the mountains. "I hear wolves' voices. Are the goblins at mischief in the woods?" He swept up into the air, and immediately 2 of his guards from the rocks at either hand leapt up to follow him. They circled up in the sky and looked down upon the ring of the wargs, a tiny spot far, far below. But eagles have keen eyes and can see small things at a great distance. The Lord of the Eagles of the Misty Mountains had eyes that could look at the sun unblinking and could see a rabbit moving on the ground a mile below, even in the moonlight. So though he could not see the people in the trees, he could make out the commotion among the wolves and see the tiny flashes of fire and hear the howling and yelping come up faint from far beneath him. Also, he could see the glint of the moon on goblin spears and helmets, as long lines of the wicked folk crept down the hillsides from their gate and wound into the wood. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel, but the ancient race of the northern mountains were the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted. They did not love goblins or fear them. When they took any notice of them at all, which was seldom, for they did not eat such creatures, they swooped on them and drove them shrieking back to their caves and stopped whatever wickedness they were doing. The goblins hated the eagles and feared them, but could not reach their lofty seats or drive them from the mountains. Tonight, the Lord of the Eagles was filled with curiosity to know what was afoot. So he summoned many other eagles to him, and they flew away from the mountains, and slowly circling ever round and round, they came down, down, down towards the ring of the wolves and the meeting place of the goblins. A very good thing too. Dreadful things had been going on down there. The wolves that had caught fire and fled into the forest had set it alight in several places. It was high summer, and on this eastern side of the mountains there had been little rain for some time. Yellowing bracken, fallen branches, deep-piled pine needles, and here and there dead trees were soon in flames. All round the clearing of the wargs, fire was leaping, but the wolf guards did not leave the trees. Maddened and angry, they were leaping and howling round the trunks, and cursing the dwarves in their horrible language, with their tongues hanging out and their eyes shining as red and fierce as the flames. Then suddenly goblins came running up, yelling. They thought a battle with the woodmen was going on, but they soon learned what had really happened. Some of them actually sat down and laughed. Others waved their spears and clashed the shafts against their shields. Goblins are not afraid of fire, and they soon had a plan which seemed to them most amusing. Some got all the wolves together in a pack. Some stacked fern and brushwood round the tree trunks. Others rushed round and stamped and beat and stamped until nearly all the flames were put out. But they did not put out the fire nearest to the trees where the dwarves were. That fire they fed with leaves and dead branches and bracken. Soon they had a ring of smoke and flame all round the dwarves, a ring which they kept from spreading outwards. But it closed slowly in, till the running fire was licking the fuel piled under the trees. Smoke was in Bilbo's eyes. He could feel the heat of flames, and through the reek he could see the goblins dancing round and round in a circle like people round a midsummer bonfire. Outside the ring of dancing warriors with spears and axes stood the wolves at a respectful distance, watching and waiting. He could hear the goblins beginning a horrible song. 15 birds in 5 fir trees, their feathers were fanned in a fiery breeze, but funny little birds, they had no wings. Oh, what shall we do with the funny little things? Roast them alive or stew them in a pot, fry them, boil them and eat them hot. Then they stopped and shouted out, "Fly away, little birds! Fly away if you can!
Come down, little birds, or you will get roasted in your nest. Sing, sing, little birds, why don't you sing?
Go away, little boys, shouted Gandalf in answer. It isn't bird nesting time. Also, naughty little boys that play with fire get punished. He said it to make them angry and to show them that he was not frightened of them, though of course he was, wizard though he was. But they took no notice and went on singing.
Burn, burn, tree and fern, shrivel and scorch, a fizzling torch to light the night for our delight. Yay! Bake and toast 'em, fire and roast 'em, till beards blaze and eyes glaze, till hair smells and skins crack, fat melts and bones black, in cinders lie beneath the sky, so dwarfs shall die and light the night for our delight. Yah-hey! Yah-harry, hey! Yah-hoy! And with that Yahoy, the flames were under Gandalf's tree. In a moment it spread to the others. The bark caught fire. The lower branches cracked. Then Gandalf climbed to the top of his tree. The sudden splendor flashed from his wand like lightning as he got ready to spring down from on high, right among the spears of the goblins. That would have been the end of him, though he would probably have killed many of them as he came hurtling down like a thunderbolt. But he never leapt. Just at that moment, the Lord of the Eagles swept down from above, seized him in his talons, and was gone. There was a howl of anger and surprise from the goblins. Loud cried the Lord of the Eagles, to whom Gandalf had now spoken. Back swept the great birds that were with him, and down they came like huge black shadows. The wolves yammered and gnashed their teeth. The goblins yelled and stamped with rage and flung their heavy spears in the air in vain. Over them swooped the eagles. The dark rush of their beating wings smote them to the floor or drove them far away. Their talons tore at goblin faces. Other birds flew to the treetops and seized the dwarves, who were scrambling up now as far as they ever dared to go. Poor little Bilbo was very nearly left behind again. He just managed to catch hold of Dory's legs as Dory was borne off last of all, and up they went together above the tumult and the burning, Bilbo swinging in the air with his arms nearly breaking. Now far below, the goblins and the wolves were scattering far and wide in the woods. A few eagles were still circling and sweeping above the battleground. The flames about the trees sprang suddenly up above the highest branches. They went up in crackling fire. There was a sudden flurry of sparks and smoke. Bilbo had escaped only just in time. Soon, the light of the burning was faint below, a red twinkle on the black floor, and they were high up in the sky, rising all the time in strong, sweeping circles. Bilbo never forgot that flight, clinging onto Dory's ankles. He moaned, "My arms! My arms!" But Dory groaned, "My poor legs! My poor legs!" At the best of times, heights made Bilbo giddy. He used to turn queer if he looked over the edge of quite a little cliff, and he had never liked ladders, let alone trees, never having had to escape from wolves before. So you can imagine how his head swam now when he looked down between his dangling toes and saw the dark lands opening wide underneath him, touched here and there with the light of the moon on a hillside rock or a stream in the plains. The pale peaks of the mountains were coming nearer, moonlit spikes of rock sticking out of black shadows. Summer or not, it seemed very cold. He shut his eyes and wondered if he could hold on any longer. Then he imagined what would happen if he did not. He felt sick. The flight ended only just in time for him. Just before his arms gave way, he loosed Dory's ankles with a gasp and fell onto the rough platform of an eagle's eyrie. There he lay without speaking, and his thoughts were a mixture of surprise at being saved from the fire and fear lest he fell off that narrow place into the deep shadows on either side. He was feeling very queer indeed in his head by this time, after the dreadful adventures of the last 3 days, with next to nothing to eat, and he found himself saying aloud, "Now I know what a piece of bacon feels like when it is suddenly picked out of the pan on a fork and put back on the shelf." "No, you don't," he heard Dory answering, "because the bacon knows that it will get back in the pan sooner or later, and it is to be hoped we shan't. Also, eagles aren't forks." "Oh no, not a bit like storks. Forks, I mean," said Bilbo, sitting up looking anxiously at the eagle who was perched close by. He wondered what other nonsense he had been saying, and if the eagle would think it rude. You ought not to be rude to an eagle when you are only the size of a hobbit and are up in his eyrie at night. The eagle only sharpened his beak on a stone and trimmed his feathers and took no notice. Soon another eagle flew up. "The Lord of the Eagles bids you to bring your prisoners to the great shelf," he cried, and was off again. The other seized Dory in his claws and flew away with him into the night, leaving Bilbo all alone. He had just the strength to wonder what the messenger had meant by prisoners, and to begin to think of being torn up for supper like a rabbit when his own turn came. The eagle came back, seized him in his talons by the back of his coat and swooped off. This time he flew only a short way. Very soon Bilbo was laid down, trembling with fear, on a wide shelf of rock on the mountainside. There was no path down onto it save by flying, and no path down off it except by jumping over a precipice. There he found all the others sitting with their backs to the mountain wall. The Lord of the Eagles also was there and was speaking to Gandalf. It seemed that Bilbo was not going to be eaten after all. The wizard and the Eagle Lord appeared to know one another slightly, and even to be on friendly terms. As a matter of fact, Gandalf, who had often been in the mountains, had once rendered a service to the Eagles and healed their lord from an arrow wound. So you see, prisoners had meant prisoners rescued from the goblins only, and not captives of the Eagles. As Bilbo listened to the talk of Gandalf, he realized that at last they were going to escape, really and truly, from the dreadful mountains. He was discussing plans with the great eagle for carrying the dwarves and himself and Bilbo far away and setting them down well on their journey across the plains below. The Lord of the Eagles would not take them anywhere near where men lived. "They would shoot at us with their great bows of yew," he said, "for they would think we were after their sheep. And at other times, they would be right. No, we are glad to cheat the goblins of their sport, and glad to repay our thanks to you, but we will not risk ourselves for dwarves in the southward plains." "Very well," said Gandalf. "Take us where and as far as you will. We are already deeply obliged to you. But in the meantime, we are famished with hunger." I am nearly dead of it," said Bilbo in a weak little voice that nobody heard. "That can perhaps be mended," said the Lord of the Eagles. Later on, you might have seen a bright fire on the shelf of rock, and the figures of the dwarves round it cooking and making a fine roasting smell. The eagles had brought up dry boughs for fuel, and they had brought rabbits, hares, and a small sheep. The dwarves managed all the preparations. Bilbo was too weak to help. And anyway, he was not much good at skinning rabbits or cutting up meat, being used to having it delivered by the butcher all ready to cook. Gandalf, too, was lying down after doing his part in setting the fire going, since Owen and Glowin had lost their tinderboxes. Dwarves have never taken to matches even yet. So ended the adventures of the Misty Mountains. Soon, Bilbo's stomach was feeling full and comfortable again, and he felt he could sleep contentedly, though really he would have liked a loaf and butter better than bits of meat toasted on sticks. He slept curled up on the hard rock more soundly than ever he had done on his feather bed in his own little hole at home. But all night he dreamt of his own house and wandered in his sleep into all his different rooms, looking for something that he could not find, nor remember what it looked like. Chapter 7. Queer Lodgings. The next morning, Bilbo woke up with the early sun in his eyes. He jumped up to look at the time and to go and put his kettle on, and found he was not home at all. So he sat down and wished in vain for a wash and a brush. He did not get either, nor tea, nor toast, nor bacon for his breakfast, only cold mutton and rabbit. And after that, he had to get ready for a fresh start. This time he was allowed to climb onto an eagle's back and cling between his wings. The air rushed over him, and he shut his eyes. The dwarves were crying farewells and promising to repay the Lord of the Eagles if ever they could, as off rose 15 great birds from the mountainside. The sun was still close to the eastern edge of things. The morning was cool, and mists were in the valleys and hollows, and twined here and there about the peaks and pinnacles of the hills. Bilbo opened an eye to peep, and saw that the birds were already high up, and the world was far away, and the mountains were falling back behind them into the distance. He shut his eyes and held on tighter.
"Don't pinch," said his eagle. "You need not be frightened. Like a rabbit, even if you look rather like one. It is a fair morning with little wind. What is finer than flying?"
Bilbo would have liked to say a warm bath and late breakfast on the lawn afterwards, but he thought it better to say nothing at all and let go his clutch, just a tiny bit. After a good while, the eagles must have seen the point they were making for, even from their great height, for they began to go down, circling round in great spirals. They did this for a long while, and at last the hobbit opened his eyes again. The earth was much nearer, and below them were trees that looked like oaks and elms, and wide grasslands, and a river running through it all. But cropping out of the ground, right in the path of the stream, which looped itself about it, was a great rock, almost a hill of stone, like a last outpost of the distant mountains, or a huge piece cast miles into the plain by some giant among giants. Quickly now to the top of this rock the eagles swooped one by one and set down their passengers.
"Farewell,"
they cried.
"wherever you fare, till your eyries receive you at the journey's end."
That is the polite thing to say among eagles.
"May the wind under your wings bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks,"
answered Gandalf, who knew the correct reply. And so they parted. And though the Lord of the Eagles became in after days the king of all birds, and wore a golden crown, and his 15 chieftains' golden collars made of the gold that the dwarves gave them, Bilbo never saw them again, except high and far off in the Battle of 5 Armies. But as that comes in at the end of this tale, we will say no more about it just now. There was a flat space on the top of the hill of stone, and a well-worn path with many steps leading down it to the river, across which a ford of huge flat stones led to a grassland beyond the stream. There was a little cave, a wholesome one with a pebbly floor, at the foot of the steps and near the end of the stony ford. Here the party gathered and discussed what was to be done.
"I always meant to see you all safe, if possible, over the mountains," said the wizard. "And now, by good management and good luck, I have done it. Indeed, we are now a good deal further east than I ever meant to come with you, for after all, this is not my adventure. I may look in on it again before it is all over, but in the meanwhile, I have some other pressing business to attend to."
The dwarves groaned and looked most distressed, and Bilbo wept. They had begun to think Gandalf was going to come all the way and would always be there to help them out of difficulties.
"I am not going to disappear this very instant," said he. "I can give you a day or two more. Probably, I can help you out of your present plight, and I need a little help myself. We have no food and no baggage and no ponies to ride, and you don't know where you are. Now, I can tell you that. You are still some miles north of the path which we should have been following, if we had not left the mountain pass in a hurry. Very few people live in these parts, unless they have come here since I was last down this way, which is some years ago. But there is somebody that I know of who lives not far away. That somebody made the steps on the great rock. The Carrack, I believe he calls it. He does not come here often, certainly not in the daytime, and it is no good waiting for him. In fact, it would be very dangerous. We must go and find him, and if all goes well at our meeting, I think I shall be off and wish you, like the eagles, farewell wherever you fare."
They begged him not to leave them. They offered him dragon gold and silver and jewels, but he would not change his mind.
We shall see, he said, and I think I have earned already some of your dragon gold when you have got it.
After that, they stopped pleading. Then they took off their clothes and bathed in the river, which was shallow and clear and stony at the ford. When they had dried in the sun, which was now strong and warm, they were refreshed, if still sore and a little hungry. Soon they crossed the ford, carrying the Hobbit, and then began to march through the long green grass and down the lines of the wide-armed oaks and the tall elms. "And why is it called the Carrack?" asked Bilbo, as he went along at the wizard's side.
"He called it the Carrack because Carrack is his word for it. He calls things like that Carracks, and this one is the Carrack, because it is the only one near his home, and he knows it well."
"But who calls it? Who knows it?"
"The somebody I spoke of, a very great person. You must all be very polite when I introduce you. I shall introduce you slowly, 2 by 2, I think, and you must be careful not to annoy him, or heaven knows what will happen. He can be appalling when he is angry, though he is kind enough if humoured. Still, I warn you, he gets angry easily."
The dwarves all gathered round when they heard the wizard talking like this to Bilbo.
"Is that the person you are taking us to now?" they asked. "Couldn't you find someone more easy-tempered? Hadn't you better explain it all a bit clearer?" and so on. "Yes, it certainly is. No, I could not, and I was explaining very carefully," answered the wizard crossly. "If you must know more, his name is Beorn. He is very strong, and he is a skin changer."
"What, a furrier? A man that calls rabbits conies when he doesn't turn their skins into squirrels?" asked Bilbo.
"Good gracious heavens, no, 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 no," said Gandalf. "Don't be a fool, Mr. Baggins, if you can help it. And in the name of all wonder, don't mention the word furrier again, as long as you're within 100 miles of his house. Nor rug, cape, tippet, muff, nor any other such unfortunate word. He is a skin changer. He changes his skin. Sometimes he is a huge black bear. Sometimes he is a great, strong, black-haired man with huge arms and a great beard. I cannot tell you much more, though that ought to be enough. Some say that he is a bear, descended from the great and ancient bears of the mountains that lived there before the giants came. Others say that he is a man descended from the first men who lived before Smaug or the other dragons came into this part of the world, and before the goblins came into the hills out of the north. I cannot say, though I fancy the last is the true tale. He is not the sort of person to ask questions of. At any rate, he is under no enchantment but his own. He lives in an oak wood and has a great wooden house. And as a man, he keeps cattle and horses which are nearly as marvelous as himself. They work for him and talk to him. He does not eat them, Neither does he hunt or eat wild animals. He keeps hives and hives of great, fierce bees and lives most on cream and honey. As a bear, he ranges far and wide. I once saw him sitting all alone on the top of the Carrack at night, watching the moon sinking towards the misty mountains, and I heard him growl in the tongue of bears, "The day will come when they will perish, and I shall go back." That is why I believe he once came from the mountains himself. Bilbo and the dwarves had now plenty to think about, and they asked no more questions. They still had a long way to walk before them. Up slope and down dale they plodded. It grew very hot. Sometimes they rested under the trees, and then Bilbo felt so hungry that he would have eaten acorns if any had been ripe enough yet to have fallen to the ground. It was the middle of the afternoon before they noticed that great patches of flowers had begun to spring up, all the same kinds growing together as if they'd been planted. Especially there was clover, waving patches of coxcomb clover and purple clover. There was a buzzing and a whirring and a droning in the air. Bees were busy everywhere, and such bees! Bilbo had never seen anything like them. If one was to sting me, he thought, I should swell up as big again as I am. They were bigger than hornets. The drones were bigger than your thumb, a good deal, and the bands of yellow on their deep black bodies shone like fiery gold. "We are getting near," said Gandalf. "We are on the edge of his bee pastures." After a while, they came to a belt of tall and very ancient oaks, and beyond these to a high thorn hedge through which you could neither see nor scramble. "You had better wait here," said the wizard to the dwarves, "and when I call or whistle, begin to come after me. You will see the way I go, but only in pairs, mind. About 5 minutes between each pair of you. Bomber is fattest and will do for 2. He had better come alone and last. Come on, Mr. Baggins, there is a gate somewhere round this way." And with that he went off along the hedge, taking the frightened hobbit with him. They soon came to a wooden gate, high and broad, beyond which they could see gardens and a cluster of low wooden buildings, some thatched and made of unshaped logs, barns, stables, sheds, and a long, low wooden house. Inside, on the southward side of the great hedge, were rows and rows of hives with bell-shaped tops made of straw. The noise of the giant bees flying to and fro and crawling in and out filled the air. The wizard and the hobbit pushed open the heavy creaking gate and went down a wide track towards the house. Some horses, very sleek and well-groomed, trotted up across the grass and looked at them intently with very intelligent faces. Then off they galloped to the buildings. "They have gone to tell him of the arrival of strangers," said Gandalf. Soon they reached a courtyard, 3 walls of which were formed by the wooden house and its 2 long wings. In the middle there was lying a great oak trunk with many lopped branches beside it. Standing near was a huge man with a thick black beard and hair, and great bare arms and legs with knotted muscles. He was clothed in a tunic of wool down to his knees, and was leaning on a large axe. The horses were standing by him with their noses at his shoulder. "Here they are," he said to the horses. "They don't look dangerous. You can be off." He laughed a great rolling laugh, put down his axe, and came forward. "Who are you, and what do you want?" he asked gruffly, standing in front of them and towering tall above Gandalf. As for Bilbo, he could easily have trotted through his legs without ducking his head to miss the fringe of the man's brown tunic. "I am Gandalf," said the wizard. "Never heard of him," growled the man. "And what's this little fellow?" he said, stooping down to frown at the hobbit with his bushy black eyebrows. "That is Mr. Baggins, a hobbit of good family and unimpeachable reputation," said Gandalf.
Bilbo bowed. He had no hat to take off and was painfully conscious of his many missing buttons.
I am a wizard, continued Gandalf. I have heard of you if you have not heard of me, but perhaps you have heard of my good cousin Radagast, who lives near the southern borders of Mirkwood. Yes. Not a bad fellow as wizards go, I believe. I used to see him now and again, said Beorn. Well, now I know who you are, or who you say you are. What do you want? To tell you the truth, we have lost our luggage and nearly lost our way and are rather in need of help, or at least of advice. I may say we have had rather a bad time with goblins in the mountains. Goblins, said the big man less gruffly. Oh, so you have been having trouble with them, have you? What did you go near them for? We did not mean to. They surprised us at night in a pass which we had to cross. We were coming out of the lands over west into these countries. It is a long tale. Then you had better come inside and tell me some of it. If it won't take all day,
said the man, leading the way through a dark door that opened out of the courtyard into the house. Following him, they found themselves in a wide hall with a fireplace in the middle. Though it was summer, there was a wood fire burning, and the smoke was rising to the blackened rafters in search of the way out through an opening in the roof. They passed through this dim hall lit only by the fire and the hole above it, and came through another smaller door into a sort of veranda propped on wooden posts made of single tree trunks. It faced south and was still warm, and filled with the light of the westering sun which slanted into it and fell golden on the garden full of flowers that came right up to the steps. Here they sat on wooden benches while Gandalf began his tale, and Bilbo swung his dangling legs and looked at the flowers in the garden, wondering what their names could be, as he had never seen half of them before. I was coming over the mountains with a friend or two, said the wizard. Or two? I can only see one, and a little one at that, said Beorn. Well, to tell you the truth, I did not like to bother you with a lot of us until I found out if you were busy. I will give a call, if I may. Go on. Call away. So Gandalf gave a long, shrill whistle, and presently Thorin and Dori came round the house by the garden path and stood bowing low before them. 1 or 3 you meant, I see, said Beorn. But these aren't hobbits, they are dwarves. Thorin Oakenshield, at your service. Dori, at your service, said the 2 dwarves, bowing again. I don't need your service, thank you, said Beorn. But I expect you need mine. I am not over fond of dwarves, but if it is true you are Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, I believe, and that your companion is respectable, and that you are enemies of goblins and are not up to any mischief in my lands. What are you up to, by the way? They are on their way to visit the land of their fathers, away east beyond Mirkwood, put in Gandalf, and it is entirely an accident that we are in your lands at all. We were crossing by the high pass that should have brought us to the road that lies to the south of your country when we were attacked by the evil goblins, as I was about to tell you. Go on telling, then, said Beorn, who was never very polite. There was a terrible storm. The stone giants were out hurling rocks. At the head of the pass we took refuge. In a cave, the Hobbit and I and several of our companions... Do you call 2 several? Well, no, as a matter of fact, there were more than 2. Where are they? Killed? Eaten?
Gone home? Well, no, they don't seem all to have come when I whistled. Shy, I expect. You see, we are very much afraid that we are rather a lot for you to entertain. Go on, whistle again. I am in for a party, it seems, and one or two more won't make much difference, growled Beorn.
Gandalf whistled again, but Nori and Ori were there almost before he had stopped, for, if you remember, Gandalf had told them to come in pairs every 5 minutes.
Hello, said Beorn. You came pretty quick. Where are you hiding? Come on, my jack-in-the-boxes.
Nori, at your service.
Ori,
they began, but Beorn interrupted them.
Thank you. When I want your help, I will ask for it. Sit down, and let's get on with this tale, or it will be supper time before it is ended.
As soon as we were asleep, went on Gandalf, a crack at the back of the cave opened, goblins came out and grabbed the hobbit and the dwarves and our troop of ponies.
Troop of ponies? What were you, traveling circus, or were you carrying lots of goods? Or do you always call 6 a troop?
Oh, no. As a matter of fact, there were more than 6 ponies, for there were more than 6 of us. And, well, here are 2 more. Just at that moment, Balin and Dwalin appeared and bowed so low that their beards swept the stone floor. The big man was frowning at first, but they did their very best to be frightfully polite, and kept on nodding and bending and bowing and waving their hoods before their knees in proper dwarf fashion till he stopped frowning and burst into a chuckling laugh. They looked so comical.
Troop was right, he said. A fine comic one. Come in, my merry men, and what are your names? I don't want your service just now, only your names, and then sit down and stop wagging.
Balin and Dwalin, they said, not daring to be offended, and sat flop on the floor looking rather surprised.
Now go on again,
said Beorn to the wizard. Where was I? Oh, yes, I was not grabbed. I killed a goblin or 2 with a flash.
Good, growled Beorn. It is some good being a wizard, then.
And slipped inside the crack before it closed. I followed down into the main hall, which was crowded with goblins. The great goblin was there with 30 or 40 armed guards. I thought to myself, even if they were not all chained together, what can a dozen do against so many?
A dozen? That's the first time I've heard 8 called a dozen. Or have you still got some more jacks that haven't yet come out of their boxes?
Well, yes, there seem to be a couple more here now. Filly and Killy, I believe, said Gandalf, as these 2 now appeared and stood smiling and bowing.
That's enough, said Beorn. Sit down and be quiet. Now, go on, Gandalf.
So Gandalf went on with the tale until he came to their fight in the dark, the discovery of the lower gate, and their horror when they found that Mr. Baggins had been mislaid. We counted ourselves and found that there was no hobbit. There were only 14 of us left.
14? That's the first time I've heard 1 from 10 leave 14. You mean 9, or else you haven't told me yet all the names of your party.
Well, of course you haven't seen Owen and Glowin yet, and bless me, oh, here they are. I hope you will forgive them for bothering you.
Oh, let them all come. Hurry up, come along, you 2, and sit down. But look here, Gandalf. Even now we have only got yourself and 10 dwarves, and the hobbit that was lost. That only makes 11 plus 1 mislaid, and not 14, unless wizards count differently to other people. But now please, get on with the tale.
Beorn did not show it more than he could help, but he really had begun to get very interested. You see, in the old days, he had known the very part of the mountains that Gandalf was describing. He nodded and he growled when he heard of the hobbits' reappearance and of their scramble down the stone slide and of the wolf ring in the woods. When Gandalf came to their climbing into trees with the wolves all underneath, he got up and strode about and muttered, "I wish I had been there. I would have given them more than fireworks."
"Well," said Gandalf, very glad to see that his tale was making a good impression, "I did the best I could. There we were with the wolves going mad underneath us and the forest beginning to blaze in places when the goblins came down from the hills and discovered us. They yelled with delight and sang songs making fun of us. 15 birds in 5 fir trees."
"Good heavens," growled Beorn. "Don't pretend goblins can't count. They can. 12 isn't 15, and they know it."
"And so do I. There were Biffer and Boffer as well. I haven't ventured to introduce them before, but here they are." In came Biffer and Boffer. "And me," gasped Bomber, puffing up behind. He was fat and also angry at being left till last. He refused to wait 5 minutes and followed immediately after the other two.
"Well, now there are 15 of you, and since goblins can count, I suppose that is all that there were up the trees. Now, perhaps we can finish this story without any more interruptions."
Mr. Baggins saw then how clever Gandalf had been. The interruptions had really made Beorn more interested in the story, and the story had kept him from sending the dwarves off at once like suspicious beggars. He never invited people into his house if he could help it. He had very few friends, and they lived a good way away, and he never invited more than a couple of these to his house at a time. Now he had got 15 strangers sitting in his porch. By the time the wizard had finished his tale and had told of the eagle's rescue, and of how they had all been brought to the Carrack, the sun had fallen behind the peaks of the misty mountains, and the shadows were long in Beorn's garden.
"A very good tale," said he. "The best I have heard for a long while. If all beggars could tell such a good one, they might find me kinder. You may be making it all up, of course, but you deserve a supper for the story, all the same. Let's have something to eat."
"Oh, yes, please," they all said together. "Thank you very much." Inside the hall it was now quite dark. Beorn clapped his hands, and in trotted 4 beautiful white ponies and several large, long-bodied grey dogs. Beorn said something to them in a queer language, like animal noises turned into talk. They went out again and soon came back carrying torches in their mouths, which they lit at the fire and stuck in low brackets on the pillars of the hall about the central hearth. The dogs could stand on their hind legs when they wished and carry things with their forefeet. Quickly they got out boards and trestles from the side walls and set them up near the fire. Then, "Bah, bah, bah," was heard, and in came some snow-white sheep led by a large coal-black ram. One bore a white cloth embroidered at the edges with figures of animals. Others bore on their broad backs trays with bowls and platters and knives and wooden spoons, which the dogs took and quickly laid on the trestle tables. These were very low, low enough even for Bilbo to sit at comfortably. Beside them, a pony pushed 2 low-seated benches with wide rush bottoms and little, short, thick legs for Gandalf and Thorin, while at the far end he put Beorn's big black chair of the same sort, in which he sat with his great legs stuck far out under the table. These were all the chairs he had in his hall, and he probably had them low like the tables for the convenience of the wonderful animals that waited on him. What did the rest sit on? They were not forgotten. The other ponies came in rolling round drum-shaped sections of logs, smooth and polished and low enough even for Bilbo. So soon they were all seated at Beorn's table, and the hall had not seen such a gathering for many a year.
There they had a supper or a dinner such as they had not had since they left the last homely house in the west and said goodbye to Elrond. The light of the torches and the fire flickered about them, and on the table were 2 tall red beeswax candles. All the time they ate, Beorn, in his deep, rolling voice, told tales of the wild lands on this side of the mountains, and especially of the dark and dangerous wood that lay outstretched far to the north and south, a day's ride before them, barring their way to the east, the terrible forest of Mirkwood. The dwarves listened and shook their beards, for they knew they must soon venture into that forest, and that after the mountains it was the worst of the perils they had to pass before they came to the dragon's stronghold. When dinner was over, they began to tell tales of their own, but Beorn seemed to be growing drowsy and paid little heed to them. They spoke most of gold and silver and jewels and the making of things by smithcraft, and Beorn did not appear to care for such things. There were no things of gold or silver in his hall, and few, save the knives, were made of metal at all. They sat long at the table with their wooden drinking bowls filled with mead. The dark night came on outside. The fires in the middle of the hall were built with fresh logs, and the torches were put out. And still they sat in the light of the dancing flames, with the pillars of the house standing tall behind them and dark at the top like trees of the forest. Whether it was magic or not, it seemed to Bilbo that he heard a sound like wind in the branches stirring in the rafters, and the hoot of owls. Soon he began to nod with sleep, and the voices seemed to grow far away, until he woke with a start. The great door had creaked and slammed. Beorn was gone. The dwarves were sitting cross-legged on the floor, round the fire, and presently they began to sing. Some of the verses were like this, but there were many more, and their singing went on for a long while. The wind was on the withered heath, but in the forest no leaf. The shadows lay by night and day, and dark things silent crept beneath. The wind came down from mountains cold, and like a tide it roared and rolled. The branches groaned, the forest moaned, and leaves were laid upon the mould. The wind went on from west to east, all movement in the forest ceased, but shrill and harsh across the marsh its whistling voices were released. The grasses hissed, their tassels bent, the reeds were rattling, on it went, a shaken pool under heavens cool, where racing clouds were torn and rent. It passed the lonely mountain bare, and swept above the dragon's lair. There black and dark lay boulders stark, and flying smoke was in the air. It left the world and took its flight over the wide seas of the night. The moon set sail upon the gale, and stars were fanned to leaping light. Bilbo began to nod again. Suddenly, up stood Gandalf. "It is time for us to sleep," he said. "For us, but not, I think, for Beorn. In this hall we can rest sound and safe, but I warn you all not to forget what Beorn said before he left us. You must not stray outside until the sun is up, on your peril." Bilbo found that beds had already been laid at the side of the hall on a sort of raised platform between the pillars and the outer wall. For him there was a little mattress of straw and woolen blankets. He snuggled into them very gladly, summertime though it was. The fire burned low, and he fell asleep. Yet in the night, he woke. The fire had now sunk to a few embers. The dwarves and Gandalf were all asleep, to judge by their breathing. A splash of white on the floor came from the high moon, which was peering down through the smoke hole in the roof. There was a growling sound outside, and a noise as of some great animal scuffling at the door. Bilbo wondered what it was, and whether it could be Beorn in enchanted shape, and if he would come in as a bear and kill them. He dived under the blankets and hid his head, and fell asleep again, at last, in spite of his fears. It was full morning when he awoke. One of the dwarves had fallen over him in the shadows where he lay and had rolled down with a bump from the platform onto the floor. It was Boffer, and he was grumbling about it when Bilbo opened his eyes. "Get up, lazy bones," he said, "or there will be no breakfast left for you." Up jumped Bilbo. "Breakfast?" he cried. "Where is breakfast?"
"Mostly inside us,"
answered the other dwarves who were moving about the hall.
"But what is left is out on the veranda. We have been about looking for Beorn ever since the sun got up, but there is no sign of him anywhere, though we found breakfast laid as soon as we went out."
"Where is Gandalf?" asked Bilbo, moving off to find something to eat as quickly as he could.
"Oh, out and about somewhere,"
they told him. But he saw no sign of the wizard all that day until the evening. Just before sunset, he walked into the hall where the Hobbit and the dwarves were having supper, waited on by Beorn's wonderful animals as they had been all day. Of Beorn, they had seen and heard nothing since the night before, and they were getting puzzled.
"Where's our host, and where have you been all day yourself?" they all cried. "One question at a time, and none till after supper. I haven't had a bite since breakfast."
At last, Gandalf pushed away his plate and jug. He had eaten 2 whole loaves with masses of butter and honey and clotted cream, and drunk at least a quart of mead, and he took out his pipe.
"I will answer the second question first," he said. "But, bless me, this is a splendid place for smoke rings."
Indeed, for a long time they could get nothing more out of him. He was so busy sending smoke rings, dodging round the pillars of the hall, changing them into all sorts of different shapes and colours, and setting them at last chasing one another out of the hole in the roof. They must have looked very queer from outside, popping out into the air, one after another, green, blue, red, silver, grey, yellow, white, big ones, little ones dodging through big ones and joining into figure eights and going off like a flock of birds into the distance.
"I have been picking out bear tracks," he said at last. "There must have been a regular bears' meeting outside here last night. I soon saw that Beorn could not have made them all. There were far too many of them, and they were of various sizes too. I should say there were little bears, large bears, ordinary bears, and gigantic big bears, all dancing outside from dark to nearly dawn. They came from almost every direction, except from the west, over the river, from the mountains. In that direction, only one set of footprints led. None coming, only ones going away from there. I followed these as far as the Carrack. They disappeared into the river, but the water was too deep and strong beyond the rock for me to cross. It is easy, though, as you'll remember, to get from this bank to the Carrack by the ford, but on the other side is a cliff standing up from a swirling channel. I had to walk miles before I found a place where the river was wide and shallow enough for me to wade and swim, then miles back again to pick up the tracks again. By that time it was too late for me to follow them far. They went straight off in the direction of the pine woods on the east side of the Misty Mountains, where we had our pleasant little party with the wargs the night before last. And now, I think I have answered your first question too, ended Gandalf.
And he sat a long while, silent. Bilbo thought he knew what the wizard meant. What shall we do? He cried. If he leads all the wargs and the goblins down here, we shall all be caught and killed. I thought you said he was not a friend of theirs.
So I did, and don't be silly. You'd better go to bed. Your wits are sleepy.
The hobbit felt quite crushed, and as there seemed nothing else to do, he did go to bed. And while the dwarves were still singing songs, he dropped to sleep, still puzzling his little head about Beorn, till he dreamed a dream of hundreds of black bears dancing slow, heavy dances round and round in the moonlight in the courtyard. Then he woke up when everyone else was asleep, and he heard the same scraping, scuffling, snuffling, and growling as before. Next morning, they were all wakened by Beorn himself.
So here you all are still,
he said. He picked up the hobbit and laughed.
Not eaten up by wargs or goblins or wicked bears yet, I see.
And he poked Mr. Baggins's waistcoat most disrespectfully.
Little Bunny is getting nice and fat again on bread and honey, he chuckled. Come and have some more.
So they all went to breakfast with him. Beorn was most jolly for a change. Indeed, he seemed to be in a splendidly good humour and set them all laughing with his funny stories. Nor did they have to wonder long where he had been or why he was so nice to them, for he told them himself. He had been over the river and right back up into the mountains, from which you can guess that he could travel quickly in bear's shape at any rate. From the burnt wolf glade, he had soon found out that part of their story was true. But he had found more than that. He had caught a warg and a goblin wandering in the woods. From these he had got news. The goblin patrols were still hunting with wargs for the dwarves, and they were fiercely angry because of the death of the great goblin, and also because of the burning of the chief wolf's nose, and the death from the wizard's fire of many of his chief servants. So much they told him when he forced them, but he guessed that there was more wickedness than this afoot, and that a great raid of the whole goblin army with their wolf allies into the lands shadowed by the mountains might soon be made to find the dwarves or to take vengeance on the men and creatures that lived there and who they thought must be sheltering them.
It was a good story, that of yours, said Beorn. But I like it still better now I am sure it's true. You must forgive my not taking your word. If you live near the edge of Mirkwood, you would take the word of no one that you did not know as well as your brother, or better. As it is, I can only say that I have hurried home as fast as I could to see that you were safe, and to offer you any help that I can. I shall think more kindly of dwarves after this. Killed the great goblin. Killed the great goblin!
He chuckled fiercely to himself. What did you do with the goblin and the warg? Asked Bilbo suddenly.
Come and see,
said Beorn, and they followed round the house. A goblin's head was stuck outside the gate, and a warg's skin was nailed to a tree just beyond. Beorn was a fierce enemy. But now he was their friend, and Gandalf thought it wise to tell him their whole story and the reason of their journey, so that they could get the most help he could offer. This is what he promised to do for them. He would provide ponies for each of them, and a horse for Gandalf, for their journey to the forest, and he would lade them with food to last them for weeks with care, and packed so as to be as easy as possible to carry. Nuts, flour, sealed jars of dried fruit, and red earthenware pots of honey, and twice-baked cakes that would keep good a long time, and on a little of which they could march far. The making of these was one of his secrets, but honey was in them, as in most of his foods, and they were good to eat, though they made one thirsty. Water, he said, they would not need to carry this side of the forest, for there were streams and springs along the road.
But your way through Mirkwood is dark, dangerous, and difficult, he said. Water is not easy to find there, nor food. The time is not yet come for nuts, though it may be past and gone indeed before you get to the other side. And nuts are about all that grows there fit for food. In there, the wild things are dark, queer, and savage. I will provide you with skins for carrying water, and I will give you some bows and arrows, but I doubt very much whether anything ye find in Mirkwood will be wholesome to eat or to drink. There is one stream there, I know, black and strong, which crosses the path, that ye should neither drink of nor bathe in. For I have heard that it carries enchantment and a great drowsiness and forgetfulness, and in the dim shadows of that place I don't think you will shoot anything, wholesome or unwholesome, without straying from the path. That you must not do for any reason. That is all the advice I can give you. Beyond the edge of the forest, I cannot help you much. You must depend on your luck and your courage and the food I send with you. At the gate of the forest, I must ask you to send back my horse and my ponies. But I wish you all speed, and my house is open to you if ever you come back this way again.
They thanked him, of course, with many bows and sweepings of their hoods, and with many an "At your service, old master of the wide wooden halls." But their spirits sank at his grave words, and they all felt that the adventure was far more dangerous than they had thought, while all the time, even if they passed all the perils of the road, the dragon was waiting at the end. All that morning they were busy with preparations. Soon after midday, they ate with Beorn for the last time, and after the meal they mounted the steeds he was lending them, and bidding him many farewells, they rode off through his gate at a good pace. As soon as they left his high hedges at the east of his fenced lands, they turned north and then bore to the northwest. By his advice, they were no longer making for the main forest road to the south of his land. Had they followed the pass, their path would have led them down a stream from the mountains that joined the great river miles south of the Carrock. At that point there was a deep ford which they might have passed if they had still had their ponies, and beyond that a track led to the skirts of the wood and to the entrance of the old forest road. But Beorn had warned them that that way was now often used by the goblins, while the forest road itself, he had heard, was overgrown and disused at the eastern end and led to impassable marshes where the paths had long been lost. Its eastern opening had also always been far to the south of the lonely mountain, and would have left them still with a long and difficult northward march when they got to the other side. North of the Carrock, the edge of Mirkwood drew closer to the borders of the great river, and though here the mountains too drew down nearer, Beorn advised them to take this way. For at a place a few days' ride due north of the Carrock was the gate of a little-known pathway through Mirkwood that led almost straight towards the lonely mountain.
The goblins, Beorn had said, will not dare to cross the great river for 100 miles north of the Carrock, nor to come near my house. It is well protected at night. But I should ride fast, for if they make their raid soon, they will cross the river to the south and scour all the edge of the forest so as to cut you off, and wags run swifter than ponies. Still, you're safer going north, even though you seem to be going back nearer to their strongholds, for that is what they will least expect. And they will have the longer ride to catch you. Be off now, As quick as you may.
That is why they were now riding in silence, galloping wherever the ground was grassy and smooth, with the mountains dark on their left, and in the distance the line of the river with its trees drawing ever closer. The sun had only just turned west when they started, and till evening it lay golden on the land about them. It was difficult to think of pursuing goblins behind, and when they had put many miles between them and Beorn's house, they began to talk, and to sing again, and to forget the dark forest path that lay in front. But in the evening, when the dusk came on, and the peaks of the mountains glowered against the sunset, they made a camp and set a guard, and most of them slept uneasily, with dreams in which there came the howl of hunting wolves and the cries of goblins. Still, the next morning dawned bright and fair again. There was an autumn-like mist white upon the ground, and the air was chill, but soon the sun rose red in the east and the mists vanished, and while the shadows were still long, they were off again. So they rode now for 2 more days, and all the while they saw nothing save grass and flowers and birds and scattered trees, and occasionally small herds of red deer browsing or sitting at noon in the shade. Sometimes Bilbo saw the horns of the harts sticking up out of the long grass, and at first he thought they were the dead branches of trees. That 3rd evening they were so eager to press on, for Beorn had said that they should reach the forest gate early on the 4th day, that they rode still forward after dusk and into the night beneath the moon. As the light faded, Bilbo thought he saw away to the right or to the left the shadowy form of a great bear, prowling along in the same direction. But if he dared to mention it to Gandalf, the wizard only said,
"Hush! Take no notice."
Next day they started before dawn, though their night had been short. As soon as it was light they could see the forest coming, as it were, to meet them, or waiting for them like a black and frowning wall before them. The land began to slope up, and it seemed to the Hobbit that a silence began to draw in upon them. Birds began to sing less. There were no more deer. Not even rabbits were to be seen. By the afternoon they had reached the eaves of Mirkwood, and were resting almost beneath the great overhanging boughs of its outer trees. Their trunks were huge and gnarled, their branches twisted, their leaves were dark and long, ivy grew on them and trailed along the ground.
"Well, here is Mirkwood," said Gandalf, "the greatest of the forests of the northern world. I hope you like the look of it. Now you must send back these excellent ponies you have borrowed."
The dwarves were inclined to grumble at this, but the wizard told them they were fools.
"Beorn is not as far off as you seem to think, and you had better keep your promises anyway, for he is a bad enemy. Mr. Baggins's eyes are sharper than yours. If you have not seen each night after dark a great bear going along with us, or sitting far off in the moon, watching our camps not only to guard you and guide you, but to keep an eye on the ponies too. Beorn may be your friend, but loves his animals as his children. You do not guess what kindness he has shown you in letting dwarves ride them so far and so fast, nor what would happen to you if you tried to take them into the forest." "What about the horse, then?" said Thorin. "You don't mention sending that back." "I don't, because I'm not sending it." "What about your promise, then?" "I will look after that. I am not sending the horse back. I am riding it."
Then they knew that Gandalf was going to leave them at the very edge of Mirkwood, and they were in despair. But nothing they could say would change his mind.
Now, we had all this out before when we landed on the Carrack, he said. It is no use arguing. I have, as I told you, some pressing business away south, and I am already late through bothering with you people. We may meet again before all is over. And then again, of course, we may not. That depends on your luck and on your courage and sense. And I am sending Mr. Baggins with you. I have told you before that he has more about him than you guess, and you will find that out before long. So cheer up, Bilbo. Don't look so glum. Cheer up, Thorin and company. This is your expedition, after all. Think of the treasure at the end, and forget the forest and the dragon, at any rate until tomorrow morning.
When tomorrow morning came, he still said the same. So now there was nothing left to do but to fill their water skins at a clear spring they found close to the forest gate and unpack the ponies. They distributed the packages as fairly as they could, though Bilbo thought his lot was wearisomely heavy and did not at all like the idea of trudging for miles and miles with all that on his back.
Don't you worry, said Thorin. It will get lighter all too soon. Before long, I expect we shall all wish our packs heavier when the food begins to run short.
Then at last they said goodbye to their ponies and turned their heads for home. Off they trotted gaily, seeming very glad to put their tails towards the shadow of Mirkwood. As they went away, Bilbo could have sworn that a thing like a bear left the shadow of the trees and shambled off quickly after them. Now, Gandalf too said farewell. Bilbo sat on the ground, feeling very unhappy and wishing he was beside the wizard on his tall horse. He had gone just inside the forest after breakfast, a very poor one, and it had seemed as dark in there in the morning as at night, and very secret. A sort of watching and waiting feeling, he said to himself.
Goodbye, said Gandalf to Thorin. And goodbye to you all. Goodbye. Straight through the forest is your way now. Don't stray off the track. And if you do, it is 1,000 to 1 you will never find it again, and never get out of Mirkwood, and then I don't suppose I or anyone else will ever see you again.
Do we really have to go through? Groaned the hobbit.
Yes, you do, said the wizard. If you want to get to the other side, you must either go through or give up your quest. And I am not going to allow you to back out now, Mr. Baggins. I am ashamed of you for thinking it. You have got to look after all these dwarves for me, he laughed.
No, said Bilbo. I didn't mean that. I meant, is there no way round?
There is, if you care to go 200 miles or so out of your way north, and twice that south. But you wouldn't get a safe path even then. There are no safe paths in this part of the world. Remember, you are over the edge of the wild now, and in for all sorts of fun wherever you go. Before you could get round Mirkwood in the north, you would be right among the slopes of the Grey Mountains, and they are simply stiff with goblins, hobgoblins, and orcs of the worst description. Before you could get round it in the south, you would get into the land of the necromancer, and even you, Bilbo, won't need me to tell you tales of that black sorcerer. I don't advise you to go anywhere near the places overlooked by his dark tower. Stick to the forest track, keep your spirits up, hope for the best, and with a tremendous slice of luck, you may come out one day and see the long marshes lying below you, and beyond them, high in the east, the lonely mountain where dear old Smaug lives, though I hope he is not expecting you.
Very comforting you are, to be sure, growled Thorin. Goodbye. If you won't come with us, you'd better get off without any more talk.
Goodbye, then. And really goodbye, said Gandalf,
and he turned his horse and rode down into the west. but he could not resist the temptation to have the last word. Before he had passed quite out of hearing, he turned and put his hands to his mouth and called to them. They heard his voice come faintly. "Goodbye! Be good! Take care of yourselves! And don't leave the path!" Then he galloped away and was soon lost to sight. "Oh, goodbye and go away," grunted the dwarves, all the more angry because they were really filled with dismay at losing him. Now began the most dangerous part of all the journey. They each shouldered the heavy pack and the water skin which was their share, and turned from the light that lay on the lands outside and plunged into the forest. Chapter 8. Flies and Spiders. They walked in single file. The entrance to the path was like a sort of arch leading into a gloomy tunnel made by two great trees that leant together, too old and strangled with ivy and hung with lichen to bear more than a few blackened leaves.